Our next speaker is Daniel Zinnel. Is it Zinnel or Zunell?
Zinnel.
Zinnel, okay. One I didn't say. Daniel Zinnel. Daniel has served as the CEO of Proteus.
Yep.
There we go. See, I'm getting better. Incorporated since August 2019, but has worked with the organization for over 6 years. He has over 10 years of nonprofit experience working with migrant and seasonal farm workers, LGBTQ community, Latinx community, and individuals with disabilities. Daniel serves as tri-chair of the social capital within Capital Crossroads and is on the Inclusion Council of the Greater Des Moines Partnership. Daniel, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Danny. And I think I have a relative on your board. Bill is my dad's first cousin, so my first cousin once removed.
Hi, Daniel. I was going to ask you if Bill was related to you because it's such an unusual name. So
yes, there's not very many of us, especially in Iowa. So it's nice to have a connection to you all. And good to see you, Julia.
Good to see you too.
Well, I have a lot of things to cover, so apologies if I go rather quickly, but I will offer my slides and email at the end if folks want to follow up for anything in particular. I wanted to add also that I did launch a side gig. So Growth and Joy is a leadership development consulting company that I started. And so been working with a variety of partners on topics related to what I'll be talking about with you today. All right, so logistics. It looks like all of you are doing this already, but keep yourself on mute. Feel free to use chat throughout. I will be using a couple activities that I'll be asking you to submit your responses through chat. And then if you can, get a pen and paper up because I'm gonna put you to work at some point. All right, next slide. I like to create brave spaces. We've kind of evolved from group agreements to safe zones to safer zones, but I like the updated term of brave spaces. So really creating the environment where everyone can feel welcome, can feel like they can participate, and really be brave in raising your hand and talking about things that maybe are a little uncomfortable. So aspects of what I consider brave spaces is the Vegas rule. So if anyone shares details about their experiences, to keep it in this room, but obviously any knowledge that you learned from today, take it outside of this Zoom call and apply it within your community, within your workplace. I love the pipe cleaner metaphor, and I have an image of the crafting pipe cleaners. So think of yourself as a pipe cleaner, knowing that they can bend, but they won't break. So thinking through kind of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, lean into that discomfort. That's where true growth can happen, and know that you are going to bend, but you won't break. One of my personal values is joy, so I love to have fun as much as I can, and hopefully we can have some fun today as well. Being authentic and present today, but are there any others that you would like to add for the next 40-ish minutes? All right, seeing none, we can move on to the next slide. I'm going to do a really quick icebreaker. Some of you may have done this before, especially if you've been in a space with me, but I think it's just so great to really bring out conversation related to these topics. So I want you in the chat to answer 2 questions for me. The first question is, how do you take your coffee? And for that question, you have 2 options, and only 2 options, plain or cream and sugar. And you have to answer. I don't care if you don't like coffee, if you hate the smell, you have to answer that question. And then the second question is, if I'm taking you to your favorite coffee shop, thank you for participating. If I'm gonna take you to your favorite coffee shop, I'll even buy, and you can order anything on the menu, what would you order? And keep in mind in Des Moines, some of our coffee shops serve alcohol. So literally any drink is on the table. So answer those 2 questions for me. Seeing some good responses so far. Lots of plains, some cream and sugars. Nice. Well, does anyone want to share? And feel free to come off mute if you would like. What do you think the purpose of this type of activity is?
To show that we're all different.
Absolutely. Especially on the second question. So even though I asked you a similar question, I allowed you to answer more authentically on the second one. So we are seeing a much more diverse response when you're authentically able to answer that question and your favorite drink, right? Anything else that stands out from this activity?
Well, for me, on the first question, you only gave me two choices, and I don't like either one of them. So, but you
Yes.
forced me into answering a question. I did not want to be in that box.
Yes, and Juliana is saying essentially the same thing. Yeah, but I think most of the time, if we're filling out forms or really anything in life, we are put into boxes from society, and it's hard for individuals that don't conform or don't fit in those boxes to really feel included, right? Anything else folks want to share? Yes, you learn more about others when you answer, or when you allow them to answer an more open-ended question rather than a binary. One other thing that I think comes up in some of the conversations I've had before with this activity is some people have never set foot in a coffee shop. And so you can think about exchanging coffee shop for your public transportation, your organization. If they've never been there, they don't know how to order, they don't know how to respond. Maybe they don't feel like that space is welcoming to them. And so how are you going to make them feel welcome? What are you going to do internally within your coffee shop to encourage folks to come and buy coffee or come and access your services? All right, next question, or next slide. Well, I think all of this work really needs to start internally as individuals, and we really need to think about our own identities, our own experiences, and how they shape the way we navigate spaces, the way we make decisions, and then be able to look externally at how others are navigating these spaces and experience more empathy for those, while also bringing more intentionality into creating more welcoming spaces for everyone to feel that sense of belonging. So I'm sharing some of my personal identities or experiences on the screen. And if you go to the next slide, I have circled the 5 that I truly feel like influence my everyday life. So my relationships with my family, being a white person, being gay, growing up on a farm, and also bronchiectasis, which required me to have 2/3 of my right lung removed at the age of 15. So these are all things that really have shaped my purview and my lens when I'm making decisions, when I'm navigating spaces. And it's so critical for me to understand these in order to either overcome maybe some biases that I've developed because of these experiences. And so I'm going to put you to work right now. I want you to spend maybe a minute or two writing down all of your experiences and identities. And then when you have your full list, maybe circle your top 5 that have influenced you the most, or maybe influence the decisions that you make every day. And then once you're done with that, you can share those top 5 in the comments if you are comfortable. You don't necessarily have to, but we'll give you a couple minutes to do all of this. I should have had music prepared to play for you while you do it, but we'll just do it in silence. That's okay.
You can sing.
I could.
Or tap dance, you're talented, Daniel.
Carrie, I'm only asking you to share what you're comfortable with. So just recognizing that we all have identities, we all have experiences, and one identity experience is not better than the other, but it's important for us to know what those are.
Here.
All right, whenever you're comfortable, feel free to start sharing those. And you don't have to, obviously, but if you're comfortable, feel free to start putting in your top 5. Thank you, Julia. As you're doing that, does anyone want to come off mute and maybe share observations or anything you're feeling from doing this activity? Thank you, Carol. Well, for the sake of time, we'll move on, but continue to type in your top 5 as you wish. But I think really, truly understanding our identities is where we need to start. And with some of our identities, we don't necessarily even think about them when we enter spaces. And I've talked to a lot of my friends and family about this, and individuals who experience a lot of privilege, like myself, sometimes we don't even, because we have so much privilege, have to think about how we enter spaces. Whereas when I'm entering a space as a gay man, I definitely have thought more about my sexual orientation and how people would respond to me if I do have to come out, because coming out is not a one and done type of thing. We have to constantly come out to people we work with, people we're around, or even as a white person, or maybe a person of color, they're going to navigate these spaces differently. So just being cognizant of that, I think, is the most important first step in navigating this work. All right, next slide. So I'm going to show you a couple of frameworks that I really appreciate. This first one is called The Cage of Oppression by Jonah Olson. And you can see all of the isms on the top, and there's a space in the center for you to add additional isms if you wanted to do this, use this framework internally within your organization. But on this top rung, you would put people who experience privilege, and then on the bottom rung, people who experience oppression or marginalization. So if you go to the next slide, it helps us fill that out. So you can see for some of these identities, who experiences privilege versus oppression. And I think it's really helpful for us as individuals to see where we experience privilege versus oppression, and not to feel guilty about this. This is just our birth lottery of what we've been handed to us in life, but what we use with the privilege or with the understanding of our oppression and marginalization is the most important piece. So once we know where we stand on privilege versus oppression and marginalization, we can better understand our own lens and then be able to be more intentional in working with others. Next slide. Another one I really like is the privilege pie, or I sometimes call it the privilege wheel. So this was developed by Elena Featherstone in 2006. This is more of similar to the Cage of Oppression, but more on a spectrum with privilege at the center and then oppression on the outside. You could add additional rings if you would want, but this had some additional things like immigration status and language. And so this is one you can put yourself on the continuum. And so for me, for example, on sexual orientation, I would be closer to oppression, but maybe not all the way to the outside, because I think there are individuals who are bisexual, pansexual, or even lesbians as women who experience more oppression based on those intersections of identities compared to me as a gay man. So this could be a fun activity that you could do with your team or within your organization to see where you fall on the privilege or oppression spectrum, and then be able to talk about it because that's an important piece to this work. And then next slide, I brought this up already, but just recognizing intersectionality, I think, is so critical. It was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She's still around and doing amazing things, so you should definitely check her out. But intersectionality is truly where our identities intersect, and sometimes that furthers marginalization or oppression, and other times it might further privilege. So me as a white man those intersections add some additional privilege for me, whereas maybe we have a transgender woman who is also a woman of color, where those identities intersect, that might further marginalization or oppression for that specific individual. Next slide. I don't know if we necessarily have enough time for this, so maybe jot down some of your feelings, and if you wanted to share in the comments, great. If not, maybe more of just self-reflection of, after going through, looking at the cage of oppression and the privileged pie and knowing where you stand or fall within those two frameworks, how is that making you feel? Is this going to change how you navigate spaces differently? So really reflect on all of those things that you're feeling, because I think as someone who grew up in Northwest Iowa, very much German, we didn't talk about feelings or emotions. And I think it's so important to talk about how we're feeling in order to truly move forward within this space and this work. All right, next slide. So I'm offering some options or opportunities for you all to break down barriers within yourself, within your department, within your organization, or even within your community. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but my personal mantra is using my privilege and power for good. All of us have privilege on this call because you are in a space where you are working professionally or maybe on a board, but all of us on this call today have some form of privilege just because we're on this call today. So we'll get started. Next slide. First step is to be humble and be willing to be vulnerable. So no one truly is an expert. I don't call myself an expert because we can only be the expert of our own identities and experiences. And it's really important when for us to admit when we don't know the answer to something, and to really enter spaces without an ego at all. This is not about us. It's about creating more inclusive environments for others as well. Number two, remember that we're human. As human beings, we are going to make mistakes no matter what. And so rather than be so paralyzed, knowing that you're going to mess up, lean into that discomfort, get uncomfortable every single day, and use it as a learning opportunity to do better next time, which leads me to the next step, which is what I call the science or art of apologizing. So knowing we're gonna mess up because this is really hard work and we can't be perfect, I have 4 easy steps for us all to follow. First step is to be sincere and authentic. Second step is to affirm them. Third step is a concise apology. 1 sentence is sufficient. And then the fourth and most important, move on. You're gonna have to probably sit and live with a little guilt, which I'll talk about in a bit, but we really need to move on. We can't make it about us. We can't make this huge scene. We can't bring it up every single time we see them. That only exacerbates it even more. And even before you get into an apology, you may want to get their consent that they're willing to talk about this right now. Maybe they want more time to think about it. Maybe they're not ready for an apology. So you need to honor where they're at and get consent in order to start with an apology. And then an additional step could be, if you've messed up multiple times or with an individual many times in a row, maybe share with them some strategies that you're going to start implementing in order to practice and do better next time. Number 4, be curious. I think all of us know how curious young people are. We hopefully remember how curious we were as kids. And I think it's really important to get back to that curiosity that we had as children and truly commit to lifelong learning. There are things that are constantly changing and evolving, and this is something that we can't check a box on and say we're done. We have to commit to this work for life because it's ever evolving, and we are now over 4 centuries into systemic racism, and it's going to take a while for us to unravel all of this. Which leads to number 5, which is educate yourself. So yes, be curious, ask questions, but also don't put the responsibility on someone else to educate you. You have access to Google and resources, so look things up. Don't put the burden on others. Next slide. Number 6, push the pause button. So there are decisions that we make every single day that impact others. So in those decisions, especially those big decisions, push the pause button and truly think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Who's truly impacted by this decision, and how can you make it different or better in order to be better for everyone? Number 7, look around the room. I think you were talking a little bit about this earlier in the previous session, but is there diverse representation? Who's missing? Who do you need to engage? Which leads to number 8, don't tokenize. So don't pat yourself on the back when you have one person living in the margins that is in your organization, on your board. You can't just stop there. Don't overuse the same people. There are many more folks to go around for sure, but also make sure your space is ready for them. So don't just add folks and expect them to be willing to make decisions for you all. You need to create those welcoming spaces ahead of time before you invite folks to join the table. 9, ask questions. So when you identify that there is maybe a lack of representation, ask some more specific questions about who's engaged. Ask about why there's maybe a lack of representation, what's been done in the past. Is there anything we could do now to move forward with some strategies or identify ways we can engage more folks? Number 10, aspire to be an ally. So I don't necessarily call myself an ally, and I don't think ally is a word we can use to describe ourselves. To me, it's a word given to us by an individual who experiences marginalization or oppression. And so in order to really commit to becoming an ally, I aspire to be an ally, because it's an action word. We need to continually work at it. We can advocate for folks, but we shouldn't overshadow or speak over others when we do advocate for others with different identities and experiences. Next slide. Number 11, to me, chaos equals progress. I think especially this last year, we have seen a lot of unrest within our country. But to me, that equals progress, because we are finally being forced to have conversations and engage in conversations with others on topics that we truly haven't talked about. And so I think even though it's really uncomfortable right now, it's progress, because we're finally having these conversations in order to move forward. Number 12, authentically engage. So recognize that this is a long game and it takes time. And you need to truly focus on developing relationships with folks in order to authentically engage. And it just takes effort to show up. So think about maybe events or different community groups that you can show up and be present at in order to further develop those relationships. 13, introduce or open doors. We all have individuals that we could introduce to other leaders, to invite to meetings or to groups, make those recommendations to boards. These are all things that we can do to further representation in those positions of power. Number 14, I think another thing that pertains to your previous conversation, but really work on creating a pipeline. So identify individuals that maybe you want to provide additional training to or mentorship in order for them to be in a place where they can take on a different role, maybe advance within their organization, and really develop a plan to address maybe the lack of representation in leadership, if that's something that you see within your organization or community. 15, I talked about this earlier, but listen and live with guilt. So it's really important to be able to listen and refrain from responding right away. Just sit there and listen. It's really hard not to get defensive, but I think it's important for us to really think about how we are responding when folks either call us out or call us in, but use that as a learning opportunity and thank them, because maybe this is something we hadn't thought about before. Maybe it's a new concept, but truly sit with that guilt and then move on. We don't have to reconcile it. It is what it is, but we can move on from it. Number 16. Language and terminology. So it's really important for us to stay on top of this, because language and terminology changes all the time. One recent terminology that I learned more about this last year was a peaceful protest versus a nonviolent protest. So individuals who were part of the Black Lives Matter movement were really advocating for the use of the term nonviolent protest. They wanted people's attention. They weren't peaceful. They weren't going to be violent, but they truly wanted to grab people's attention. So that was the difference between the two. Number 17, Focus internally, but you got to start. So this is truly a personal experience and a personal journey as we navigate this space, but it's important for us to do something. So read, listen, observe, reflect, but truly start this work now. 18, anti-racism is another term that I think has taken off, especially this last year. So it's not enough just to be against racism. We need to take action and do something and or truly commit to becoming anti-racist. 19, do something every single day. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So recognize that this is something we're gonna have to do for the rest of our lives. Talk with others, and also develop really good facilitation skills, especially on social media, because we don't want to just call people out on social media. It's a really hard place to really engage in constructive conversations or important conversations. And so really work on how you are facilitating or how you're having conversations on social media in order to not shut people down, but truly better understand their point of view and maybe offer your point of view as well. Number 20, unlearn and then relearn history. So our history has been taught to us with bias, and it's really important for us to understand the true historical events that have taken place in our country and better understand them in order to continually move forward with educating our young people and educating ourselves on what happened truly within our country. And then finally, practice, practice, practice. This is something we can't become an expert ever on, but we can practice this every day and continually work at becoming better within our organization, within our community, but also find a colleague that maybe you can create brave spaces with each other and practice together. All right, next slide. Well, we'll do the first one first. So maybe what is one of the 21 best practices that I have shared so far that you think you do really well so far? Feel free to add that in the chat.
I'm going to jump in here, Daniel, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have done, the best practice that I've exemplified is to educate yourself. And I think this is this happened to a lot of us, especially with everything that's going on. You want to reach out to people who are being marginalized and ask for their help. And I was doing that too. And you have great intentions on like why you're reaching out, but then it took. So one of my friends finally told me like, "Hey, I appreciate you're doing this, but not only you are doing it, but I also have 15 other friends that are doing this to me, and there's just a lot of pressure on me."
Mm-hmm.
So like I hadn't even thought about that. So I'm like, that's a really good tip. So that's definitely something I have switched over to doing, is just educating myself.
Thank you for sharing, Dan. Yeah, it's a lot of emotional labor that folks who have identities within where they experience marginalization or oppression to continually educate others on. So I think it really depends on your relationship with that person. Some people love doing that, and others it's a lot to take on. But I would also encourage you to check out organizations that focus specifically on maybe identities or experiences, because that's what they do professionally. So if you have questions about maybe the LGBTQ community, I know Max, I think, is speaking today, reach out to One Iowa. That's what they're there for, as a resource to better understand how you can better navigate, be more inclusive for LGBTQ folks. I'm seeing some good responses in the chat. So thank you for sharing the one that you think you do really well. And Danny, you may want to like flip back slowly through the last 3 slides, but what are maybe 1 to 3 that you want to start maybe doing better today? Feel free to share those in chat. Or if you want to take yourself on mute and share out loud, that's great too.
Goodness.
So true, Julia, yes. Thanks, Kendra. Well, you can keep adding and typing. Thank you for participating. But I think for me, we have greater accountability when we say things out loud and write them down in order to move forward with this work. So I encourage you to write these down and keep them and share them with maybe your colleagues so that you have more accountability in moving forward with this work. All right, Danny, next slide. So thinking about how we can integrate anti-racism and moving beyond barriers within our company, within our leadership team, within our community, possibly as well, but also as individuals. These are ways that we can move forward with this work and kind of ties in with what was discussed in the previous session. So on the bottom, we as individuals, we can implement the 21 best practices. We can also kind of, do more grassroots efforts to really bubble things up that we're seeing on the ground to our leaders within our community, to leaders within our company, so that they better understand what we are seeing on the ground. Leadership can implement the 21 best practices, but they also set the tone related to diversity, equity, and inclusion and the culture within our organization or within our community. So it's really up to them on how they set the tone. And then company or community-wide, launching a diversity, equity, and inclusion council, updating policies is really important. And they also can set the tone related to DEI, specifically in the brand that you are conveying out externally as well. All right, next slide. So where to start? You can start in any of these 6 boxes, but it's kind of a cycle, if you will. So let's start on the bottom left. So individual can keep the company accountable and in living out anti-racism or diversity, equity, and inclusion and really bubble that up. The company can take a stand. Company could create a DEI council, could work on policies, not only put out statements, but leadership walks the walk and the actions that they take within their company and in their community. And then leadership sets the tone for future work related to anti-racism or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide. So these are very familiar to us in Iowa. And since you're in transportation, you are very accustomed to these sorts, maybe not the car in the center, bottom center photo, but the other ones, we're very accustomed to these potholes. But there are beautiful potholes, if you go to the next slide, in the ocean. Does anyone know how these potholes are created in the ocean? Any guesses?
Brooke says turtles.
Turtles, waves. Waves are part of it, yes. Any other thoughts? Magic. I like that. Harry Potter, he does it. Well, actually, one grain of sand gets caught in a crack, creates a little space, and with the waves, another grain of sand gets caught, and over time, more and more grains of sand get caught. So you can go to the next slide. So I truly think we are all grains of sand, and if we use our privilege and power for good, we can create those spaces where everyone feels welcome, everyone feels like they can access services, everyone feels like they belong within our workplace. So truly know that even though you're just one person, you can create these beautiful potholes like the ocean and use your privilege and power for good. All right, I think I wanted to save enough time for questions. So it looks like we have 10 minutes for questions right now. But I have my email on if you want access to these specific slides or want to further the conversation. Before I open up to questions, I will add that I'm working with Dr. Eddie Moore, who runs the White Privilege Conference and also owns America and More. We're developing a curriculum that goes further into what I've shared today that'll be called Power, Privilege, Leadership, and More. It's going to be a 10-week virtual program for aspiring leaders to participate in, knowing that it takes about 10 weeks on average to change behavior. So we wanted to focus on a 10-week program, variety of speakers. It'll be, I think, an exciting program that we're going to start offering probably at some point this summer. So stay tuned for more details, but wanted to at least share that to get it on your radar for now. And now I can turn it over to questions.
Put questions in the chat or take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask them if you like. Leanne asks, where to start with employees who do not believe this is essential?
Such an important question. I think asking more open-ended questions with them and just better understanding where they're coming from, I think is where I would start. Even before that, hopefully you have a relationship with them. So if you don't, maybe work on building a relationship with them. And then it's going to be easier to engage in these conversations and asking more open-ended questions on their point of view, where they're coming from, so you can better understand. We're not necessarily trying to convince everyone to get behind this, but I think it's important to at least help people recognize the importance of this work moving forward, and that we all have different identities and experiences. And just because we have a great experience doesn't mean others in our community are going to. And so really helping them look beyond themselves, which is hard sometimes, and thinking about everyone in their community, wanting to access services, wanting to thrive, which can be a hard conversation. But I think developing the relationship and then open-ended questions is where I would start.
Brooke says, to tag on to Leanne, also with older employees who have limited exposure to specifically diverse races.
Another great question. And I lived there. I was in Calhoun County, went to Palmer, K through 12 in one building, 0 people of color. So I can definitely see where this comes up a lot, because it's hard. It's easy to hate someone we don't know. It's harder to hate someone we do know. So I would encourage folks to, if they can, bring different people to speak to their groups so that they can develop a relationship with somebody who might be different than them. Because when we can help them overcome what I call cognitive dissonance, we can then help them see this person, one, as a human being. Like, we are all one human race. That's where we start, right? So if we can all bring in the humanity, I think it's going to help them overcome the cognitive dissonance of how this policy, how this structure impacts this new person that now maybe I really like or even love. So being able to bring them together, I think, is a critical component to helping them overcome maybe bias or whatever might be going on in their community.
Daniel, I have a question. So when we're trying to work on this and then somebody is just, rude or disengaging or, just non-accepting of any of it, how do we address that, or do we just stay focused on what the message is that we're trying to get? Because I don't want that to come into, I think I don't want that to come into play and disrupt what we're trying to do, but I also don't want that to just not be addressed either. Yeah,
well, without knowing or without giving specific scenarios, I think sometimes having the conversation, is this the right fit? If it's an employee, especially if this is a value of our organization, if we've made a statement or we're taking a stand and truly believe in this work, having that conversation of where do we align on this? And maybe this is not the best fit for everyone to be involved within our organization or within this work. And those are hard conversations to have. If it's more volunteer or someone that we don't necessarily have that type of relationship with, we're going to always encounter people who are what I would put in the 5% maybe of not necessarily opposed, but we're never going to change their mind on this. My philosophy is always to focus on the movable middle, which makes up about 75% of our population. most people believe in fairness and kindness, and we can all start from that place of creating that type of environment where everyone has respect, and we want to create a civil community. We want everyone to have the opportunity to access services. I think 75% of the movable middle is going to get behind that. And those are the folks that I like engaging more with, because we can then further those conversations to help them better understand maybe something that would influence them changing their mind, or allowing us to maybe better understand their point of view to change our minds. So you're going to have people on both sides of this type of work, but I like to focus on the movable middle.
Thank you. I just don't want, I think we sometimes get polarized as a society because we are so firm in what we believe is right.
Yep.
And so sometimes that's just polarizing. And when you're dealing with diverse populations, especially in the workforce or in partnerships or those types of things, I just don't want, we don't want that. That doesn't push anybody forward. So
I think starting with affirming that everyone has the right to their opinions, their beliefs, we're not wanting to change that. But when we are working within a company or on a project together, there are principles, there are values, there are policies that we all need to follow. And so I think taking people out of it is helpful when you can focus more on this is the environment, this is the values, these are the policies. I think that truly helps.
Okay, thank you very much.
Brooke, you might be on mute.
Brooke, we can't hear you.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I wasn't on mute. I just had the wrong speaker on. So I think to kind of add to what Julia said, like as transit systems, I think we're, trying to create inclusive environments, not only because of our workforce, but because we're serving the entire community. And so it's not just one small demographic, and it's not all about what Danny believes or what I believe or what Julia believes. But we've had trainings that, and this isn't about diversity by any means, but we've had just basic driver skill trainings, and we've had people who just don't want to participate or pay attention. So we've had to pull them to the side and say, listen, this is a safety culture, and you have to participate in this culture, or this isn't going to be the right fit. And I think that culture of inclusion is important to have the same mentality. It's no different than our safety culture, because we need our drivers who interact with all sorts of people, whether they have mental health issues, whether they have gender identity differences than the driver themselves, or a race difference than the driver, or their primary language isn't English. We still have to be respectful of them as people and make them feel that using the bus is a safe form of transportation and a safe place for them. So I guess I look at it more like with the drivers, which is primarily who our employees are, that it's more of this is the culture and this is what we're working towards. But if I'm wrong, clarify me on that.
I think you're spot on. You're spot on. I love that. Thank you. Any other questions?
I really like what Brooke said, that it's a part of safety culture. I never thought of it from that perspective, but it really ties into the overall safety of your riders. I really like that. So good point, Brooke.
And the overall safety of our employees as well, especially those drivers that we're putting out on a bus that are very vulnerable to anyone who steps onto that bus. So, those are all things that we have to think about. They're not working in a building that has a lot of protection, and in rural transit, a lot of times it's just the driver and one other person. And so, that could put them in a very vulnerable position. And we all have seen how many drivers in urban areas have been attacked over things that have to do with, again, polarization issues. And so I totally am on board with what Brooke is saying. This is definitely part of creating that safety culture. So that was a good discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brooke.
Well, don't thank me. Thank you for having it. I wanted to make sure, to kind of expand on what Julia's question was, that we're on the right, that we're on target with what we're doing in the message that we're presenting to our employees. And that, like you said, starts at the top, which, we have a very diverse leader who believes in diversity and inclusion. So we're fortunate there, but I just wanted to make sure we were, on the right page. So.
Awesome, thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions for Daniel or any comments? I really appreciate it, Daniel. I've been at a lot of your talks, that you've done over the years, and just knowing you personally. And so I really appreciate you being here. Did not know you were related to one of my board members, though, so I'm going to get that corrected and let him know. But I really appreciate you being here today. I think this was a great topic and one we all needed to kind of hear. And it just gives us a different way of thinking about things, and we can always do better. No matter how good we think we are, we can always do better. So really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course.